There's been a horrific shooting in Texas in which a 10-year-old girl was the only survivor. On the 30th of May at around 5 p.m, gunshots could be heard in Spring in Texas. It's believed that a shooting occurred at an apartment complex involving 2 adults and a child. The female victim is said to have been 33 and the mother to the 10-year-old girl. The male was 39 years old. Police state that the male was the mother's boyfriend. He's believed to have shot the mother in a dispute and the child was caught in the crossfire. The man is then said to have turned the gun on himself. Although tragically the mother passed away, after being shot in the stomach, the 10-year-old girl miraculously survived. It's reported that she bravely managed to call her nan to get help. Her nan then called 911 and officers raced to the scene. The child was airlifted to hospital and underwent life-saving surgery. She is currently believed to be in the custody of her grandmother. Police have called the incident a murder self-unaliving and aren't looking for any other suspects.
These are illegal islands you can't visit but people went anyway, part 1. Up first is North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island is one of the Andaman Islands and is home to an indigenous tribe. They are called the Sentinelese and they are an uncontacted tribe who allow no visit from the outside world. But in 2018, John Chow illegally traveled to the island in an attempt to convert the tribe to Christianity. And to no surprise, John was killed by the Sentinelese as they allow no contact with the outside world. John paid 2 fishermen $335 to take him near the island and the 2 fishermen were arrested. And it's also believed that John knew his fate as he wrote in his diary, "Please do not be angry at them, or God if I get killed. Don't retrieve my body." John tried to visit the island 3 times but failed the first 2 times as the tribe got mad at him. And on his last visit, John told the fishermen to abandon him on the island. And the fishermen later saw the tribe dragging John's body and the next day they saw his body being buried on the shore. And some sources even claim that the Sentinelese people ate John's body. So whatever you do, you should never ever go to North Sentinel Island.
Sarah Stern, right? She had lost her mother. She had gotten a big inheritance from her mother. Her aunt told her to not tell anybody, right?
Okay.
No friend, no family member. She ends up telling her friend Liam. They were friends since they were 6. Time goes by and shit until out of nowhere they can't find Sarah. They end up asking a few close members who was the last person that was always next to Sarah.
They said Liam, didn't they?
They start asking him questions. When was the last time you saw Sarah? And he's like, oh, yesterday we went out to eat. I dropped her off and I went to go to work. That was the last time I saw her. A couple of days go by. They start asking him more questions and they were like, did she ever mention like she wanted to escape or... And he was like, oh yeah, she has a lot of self-destructive tendencies. Her mother's loss would always get to her and stuff. But the thing that was weird about it is that why would she commit after finding about all of this money?
Makes no sense.
Some time passed by. He told his friend like some weird ass idea. Imagine a film where I kill this person and then I throw him off a bridge and
Oddly specific.
Yeah, exactly. So he went to the cops and said, he mentioned this story to me, but like maybe it was a crazy idea that he had, but I don't know, it felt like a little bit too coincidental. The cops end up telling him to meet up with Liam and they put a security camera in there, like, call his confession? Watch.
I got the FBI on my ass, dude.
About what?
About killing Sarah. That's not even the worst part. The worst part of it is
Delaware. Yes. I need everyone's phones. I want them all to FaceTime their family. Hi.
This is former Mr. Beast employee Delaware, aka Charles Robert Jefferson. Now, Delaware, as he was known on the channel, appeared in a few Mr. Beast videos. Ironically, that clip from the beginning of the video was from a video where Mr. Beast and the crew spent time in prison. And this is where it gets disturbing. So you can see right here, he's registered, meaning he's a registered sex offender. And these charges are incredibly disturbing. Now, Charles Robert Jefferson, he was actually only 16 when this stuff happened. So I've seen people online talking about how he should be given a break because he was also a minor, which is completely wrong. Because as you can see, the victim of this crime was 11 years old. I mean, let that sit for a second. That's disturbing. That's really disturbing. And something else bizarre about this whole thing is that Delaware, when he was in the Mr. Beast videos and when he was featured, they only called him by this nickname, Delaware. I am assuming that was an attempt to hide his identity. And also, he frequently wore masks, which I can assume also was an attempt to hide his real identity. And when you hire somebody like this that has this sort of thing in their past to work on a YouTube channel with entertainment geared towards kids, I understand why he wouldn't want people to know who this guy really was. But that's disturbing, isn't it? I mean, you would imagine that somebody would have had to do a background check on that guy, especially before not only hiring him, but putting him on camera multiple times. And I'm sure that Mr. Beast Jimmy is going to come out and say he had no idea, blah, blah, blah. But then why the attempts to hide his identity? Why the nickname? Why wearing the mask when nobody else was doing that sort of a thing? And when you're an entertainer as large as Mr. Beast, when you run such a massive company, and a massive significant portion of your audience is children and minors, there definitely shouldn't have been any sex offenders working on the show. If you want to join me as I expose pedophile rings and talk about these horrific sorts of crimes, listen to my new podcast, The Conspiracy Files, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or check out my YouTube channel. This stuff is a major problem, not only here in America, but across the planet. And only by waking people up to this shit are we going to be able to change something.
This is the scariest story about the family portraits. One day, there was a man who was hunting in the woods, and as night fell, he found himself in an unfamiliar part of the forest. He walked and walked, but he couldn't find his way home. Wandering aimlessly in the dark, he eventually came to a small clearing where an old ramshackle cabin stood. Tired and weary, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. When he came closer to the cabin, he saw that the door was standing wide open. Poking his head inside, he could see that the little cabin was completely empty, but there was a bed and a fire burning in the fireplace. The hunter threw himself on the bed and decided to sleep there for the night. If the owner came back, he would ask his permission in the morning. Lying on the bed half asleep, he looked around and was surprised to see the walls were covered with paintings. They appeared to be family portraits, all framed and painted in incredible detail. They seemed very lifelike, and without exception, each portrait was uglier than the next. The hideous faces in the paintings made him incredibly uneasy. The way they were painted made it seem as if their eyes were staring directly at him. It was incredibly unnerving. He decided that the only way he was going to get any sleep was to ignore the hideous faces staring at him. So he turned on his side facing the wall and pulled the blanket over his head and drifted off to sleep. In the morning, when the hunter woke up to find the cabin completely lit up by sunlight, he looked around and noticed that there was no family portraits on the walls at all. There was only windows.
You will never convince me that once a deranged person starts brutally killing, that they suddenly just stop. I'm specifically talking about how in 1979, a killer stalked and murdered 5 people in Houston, Texas within 2 months, and in 2 of those cases kept the victims' heads, yet they've never been found. The killing started at the Orchard Apartments on 5909 Glenmont Drive in Houston. On the morning of July 27, 1979, a coworker of 33-year-old Alice Rankin arrived at her apartment to pick her up for work. His name was Bob. At the time, Alice's car was in the shop being repaired, and since the two both worked for the same engineering firm, Bob agreed to pick her up and take her to work until her car was fixed. But when he arrived, he noticed that Alice's front door was slightly ajar, and when he peeked inside, he saw Alice lying nude in her bed with both of her feet bound together. A pillow was covering the upper half of her body, and when he moved the pillow, he saw a gruesome sight. Alice had been decapitated and her head was missing. So obviously Bob called 911, and when Houston police arrived, they found a puddle of blood dripping down the side of her bed. And this turned out to be where the killer set her head down after removing it. A blood trail was then discovered dripping outside of her front door and into the apartment's parking lot. Police believe that after the killer decapitated her, they calmly walked out of the apartment holding her head, tossed it into their car, and drove off. And despite a massive search, her head has never been found. There's practically no evidence left behind, but police did know that she was sexually assaulted. This brutal murder was already enough to put people on edge, but then 2 weeks later, and just 2 floors above Alice in that same apartment complex, the body of 27-year-old Mary Calcutta was found in her bathroom. She'd been stabbed dozens of times and was also sexually assaulted just like Alice. According to Houston police, Mary fought back harder than any victim they had ever seen, starting at the front door until she just couldn't fight anymore. The killer stabbed her with such force that the knife went all the way through her and actually bent the blade. Since they were both killed in the same apartment complex, the police started to piece together any connection or link that the two might have, and the only thing they found on top of living in the same complex was that they were both women who lived alone. They also found butcher knives in both of their apartments, which I'm assuming was the murder weapon. Because of this, police believe that it was the same person who murdered both women. After these grisly murders, a lot of people began moving out of the Orchard Apartments. But in a shocking twist, on the same day that Mary's body was found, another brutal murder occurred just a few miles away. On August 10th, 1979, an exterminator walked into a Houston townhouse and found the body of of 26-year-old Doris Threadgill. Her throat had been slashed so violently and so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. Fear spread throughout Houston as police worked to figure out who was doing this. But then, the killer struck again, and another headless victim was found. On the evening of October 3rd, just 2 months later, police were called to a neighborhood near Freed Park in northwest Houston. A resident heard a woman screaming, quote, "Help, don't do this to me." When they looked out their window, they saw a woman being dragged by her hair into a house by a man in a hat, and then they heard a gunshot, followed by silence. This all took place on the front porch of a house just 5 blocks away from Doris's home. When Houston police arrived, they did an incredibly small investigation but found no blood on the front porch. So they told the residents that what they heard were actually just firecrackers and not gunshots. But just the next morning, police came back and they did in fact find blood on the front porch. And shortly after this, they discovered the body of 16-year-old Joanne Huffman. They found her in Watonga Park about 4 miles away, and she had been shot in the mouth. And if you didn't already guess, this turned out to be the woman that was screaming on the front porch just the night before. As this was unfolding, authorities were called to a nearby used car dealership. A sales manager stumbled across a white Dodge covered in blood, and when police opened the trunk, they found the headless body of 18-year-old Robert Spangenberger, who was Joanne's boyfriend. Robert and Joanne were reportedly going to get married, and just the night before had gone out to have some fun. But by the next morning, both of them were dead, and just like Alice, Robert's head has never been found. The community then dubbed this killer as the Houston Decapitator. Unfortunately, no evidence was left behind at either scene, and to this day, all 5 murders remain unsolved. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, absolutely nothing, which is terrifying to me considering just how brutal each murder was. The only theory that police have is that the Orchard apartment murders of Alice and Mary were committed by the same killer, who they believe has way more victims than just the 2. But Houston homicide detectives aren't sure if the murders of Joanne and Robert were committed by the same killer, and they found no link or connection to the murder of Doris. After these murders, it seems like the killer just stopped, and nothing else was ever connected to these cases. Because of how seemingly random and violent these murders were, it's left many wondering if there was a serial killer terrorizing Houston in 1979, and if they're still out there.
In 2008, right?
Yeah.
There was a case with a Greyhound bus. Tim McLean was going from Edmonton to Winnipeg. This happened in Canada.
Okay, I was gonna say, where the fuck is that?
All the witnesses say he was in the back of the bus with his hoodie on, headphones on. He wasn't really focusing on anything, wasn't talking to anybody, right? A couple hours later, on a different stop, this guy, Vincent Lee, gets on. At first, he ended up sitting in the front of the bus, away from everybody else, and he ends up going all the way to the back of the bus and sits right next to Tim McLean. He didn't really think too much of it, right? Until out of nowhere, Vincent pulled out a knife and he just started stabbing his chest and his neck.
Fuck.
The passengers start freaking out and the bus driver pulls over. They all rush to get off. The bus driver tries to get back on to help Tim. It's already too late. Like, people start calling 911 and stuff. That's when Vincent starts cutting his head off. Takes it and start like showing it to everybody.
Like, look what the fuck I did.
And he starts cutting little pieces off. First he eats his heart, and then he starts eating the rest of his body as well.
Wait, in front of the cops, or he's been doing that?
He's in front of the cops, bro. He obviously stops and gets arrested. He ends up obviously on trial and shit. March 2009 mark him as mentally insane, and they can't put him in jail. The reason why was because he said Tim was a demon and that God had told him to kill him.
It sounds like some schizophrenia.
But then over time he was slowly given more freedom. He was allowed to a different city with supervision.
Bro, don't tell me some shit's gonna happen.
And in 2017 he was set free, and still to this day
He's free?
they gave him the right to legally change his name.
So you're telling me if he had moved to the US,
Somebody could have passed him, bro, and they would have never known.
Imagine.
This case will put you off ever dating a man again. It was August 2023 in Ohio. Shannon Hyatt and Chance Donahoe had previously dated for around a year and a half. Now, the relationship was far from a happy one, and when the pair eventually split up, Shannon actually felt the need to install security cameras in her home and change the locks. She did everything she could to cut contact. She blocked him on social media, and she even had a mutual friend return his property to him so she didn't have to contact him or see him. And Shannon was right to be concerned. Chance heard rumours that Shannon was moving on and started seeing someone new. Disturbingly, he'd been hanging around outside her house and actually saw a male's car parked outside. He thought if he couldn't have her, nobody could. On the 29th of August, when Shannon was alone in the home, he wouldn't have done this when a male's car was parked outside, Chance broke into her house. He ambushed the innocent woman, attacking and stabbing her. The attack was so violent he inflicted over 30 stab wounds on her. Once he had murdered her, he screwed Shannon's door shut in an apparent attempt to prevent her body from being found. Disturbingly, Chance had also abused Shannon's body after killing her. Now, Chance fled to a petrol station in Liberty Township before eventually handing himself over to police. He admitted the killing and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder. He also pleaded guilty to abuse of a corpse. He was given 31 years in prison with the chance of parole.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, no one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
This pedophile senator from North Dakota is one of the most disturbed people I've ever researched. This is all coming out right now in the news, so let's talk about it. Ray Holmberg was born in 1944, and he was first elected to the North Dakota Senate as a Republican in 1976. He ended up serving as a senator for decades, and he became one of the longest serving senators in United States history. But behind the scenes, Ray was carrying out the most demonic activities you can imagine. The first allegations against him came out in 2020, when a man named Canton Todd came out and said that Ray had sexually assaulted him in 2010. You can read some of his tweet there. Canton provided evidence of where he was assaulted, and investigators were actually able to show that that apartment was indeed owned by the senator. And they were also able to confirm that the senator was seen with that guy around the same time. But nothing ever came out of this. Then in 2022, a huge scandal erupted. It turns out Ray Holmberg had shared 72 text messages with a child predator inside of prison. So this guy was sentenced for CP production and distribution. And while he was in prison, Ray Holmberg texted him 72 times. Now, obviously, people were asking, what were these texts about? Well, some of the texts that were eventually recovered showed Holmberg asking this convicted predator if he could meet up with his 19 to 20-year-old boyfriend to give him a massage. Holmberg has claimed in the news that these text messages were just about some lawn care, that this pedophile just happened to be redoing his lawn and that's what he was texting him about. And when he was pressed by members of the press, he stated the messages were just simply gone. I don't understand this. In most cases, the police can immediately go back and retrieve any text messages from criminals. So why haven't they done this yet with this guy? But this only gets significantly worse. Just 2 days ago, Ray Holmberg pled guilty to child sex tourism. If you're confused on what that means, this means that Ray, while he was a United States Senator, was traveling overseas to engage in acts with minors. Prosecutors in the case alleged that he traveled 14 times to Prague in the Czech Republic between the years 2011 and 2021 to pay to engage in acts with minors. And even more disturbingly, a number of these trips were state trips. So that means that the United States government was paying for him to go over to the Czech Republic. And he was there on an official capacity. So he definitely did this, and when this all came out, it brought up the history of CP charges that were also leveled at him in the past. That's right, they also discovered that between 2012 and 2013, Ray, who was a United States Senator at the time, was using the alias Sean Evans online to, quote, convince a child to send him sexually explicit images. AKA, this freak was pretending to be a child online to receive CP from a child. So with all of this, the sexual assault, the traveling to a country to engage in acts with minors, the CP, all of that, you would imagine this guy would go away for a long time, right? These are serious, terrible charges. Well, no, because he pled guilty, he's going to get a sweetheart deal. That means that the Department of Justice dropped the CP charges against him, and the judge is believed to, quote, recommend the low end of the sentencing guideline range. His lawyers have said they expect him to get 3 to 4 years in prison. So for molesting multiple young boys, for convincing a child to send him graphic material, for sexually assaulting a man, for being in contact with a child predator who probably sent him other stuff that got deleted, this guy is going to get 3 to 4 years in prison. Gotta love American justice, right? If you want to join me on my journey to expose pedophiles and creeps like this, listen to my new podcast, The Conspiracy Files. You can either watch it on YouTube or you can listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And in a few weeks, we're going to be doing an episode about pedophile members of Congress and the Senate, and it's really, really disturbing stuff. This guy's definitely going in there.
This woman fatally stabbed her boyfriend over 100 times during what her lawyer said was a cannabis-induced psychosis. Yet she walked free and only got community service. This is Bryn Spacher. She met 26-year-old Chad O'Melia at a dog park in California in early May of 2018, and the two began dating. But only a few weeks later, she would go on to brutally kill him. It was around midnight on May 27th when she went over to his apartment in Thousand Oaks, California, and the two began smoking weed out of a bong. According to Bryn, she didn't want to take the last hit, but she said that Chad pressured her into doing it. Sometime after, according to her, she had an adverse reaction to the weed and proceeded to stab him 108 times with multiple different knives. When authorities arrived, they found Chad lying in a pool of blood. Bryn was screaming hysterically and holding a long serrated bread knife, and before police could get to her, she plunged the knife into her own neck. Authorities had to tase her and hit her multiple times with their batons to subdue her. Chad was pronounced dead at the scene, but paramedics were able to save Bryn's life. She was initially arrested after the incident, but was released on bail, where she would go on to live her life free in the public until the trial began in December of last year. Bryn was facing only 4 years in prison, but during the trial, her attorney claimed that the murder was a direct result of a cannabis-induced psychotic disorder. They also said that she was involuntarily intoxicated because Bryn claimed that Chad intimidated her into taking the last bong hit. And under California criminal law, people are responsible for their actions when impaired by alcohol or drugs, unless their intoxication was involuntary. Because of this, the jury took less than 4 hours to convict her of involuntary manslaughter. Judge David Worley of the Ventura County Superior Court sentenced her to 2 years probation with no prison time at all for the murder. Bryn also has to complete 100 hours of community service focused on raising awareness about the effects of marijuana-induced psychosis. Judge Worley said that his decision was based on the lack of culpability. He said that from that point forward, after smoking marijuana, Bryn had no control over her own actions. Bryn's lawyer was obviously very happy with this ruling, as he said, quote, "Judge Worley did the right and courageous thing," end quote. On the other hand, Chad's family is completely heartbroken over this decision. He was only 26. He was a hardworking accountant. He was kind, motivated, and everyone's friend, and he had his whole life ahead of him. His family says that this ruling sets a dangerous precedent, and that Judge Worley basically just gave everyone in the state of California who smokes weed a license to kill. This case is honestly insane, but I'm curious to know what you guys think about it.
This cult is called Heaven's Gate. It gained its infamy in 1997 when all of the members, it was led by two people, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. And many people were attracted to their cult because they blended a lot of science fiction and a bunch of Christian aspects to it. So for example, they taught that Mary from the Bible, she was abducted by a spacecraft and that's how she got impregnated. And the premise of the whole cult was that a UFO was gonna come and sweep all the cult members and save them and bring them to this new afterlife. It was called Tella, and that anybody on Earth that didn't go on the UFO, they would basically be wiped out and killed. And then Bonnie ended up dying from cancer, and the co-members were like, what the fuck now? He ended up twisting the message around to saying that she did ascend to Tella and that aliens had gave her a signal. If she left her body as a vessel, she would still ascend. If you leave your body behind, which is him saying if you could ascend. 1997 comes, they're gonna go to this mansion that they have in San Diego. The first group would go, they would drink sleeping medicine, applesauce, and then chug a bunch of vodka. Put a bag over their heads, they would just die. Then the second group would come in, clean up the mess, put their bodies in beds, and then they would put a purple blanket on top of their heads. And then that group would do the same thing. Then the third group had Marshall in it, did the same thing as well. Total of 39 members ended up dying. And also, before their whole hours before, they recorded interviews of them basically saying their goodbyes. Or
people in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
Now you're gonna find this old crummy vehicle.
This disturbing Venezuelan video is absolutely awful, and whatever you do, don't go searching for it. In January of 2018, a gruesome video went viral in Venezuela and Latin America. Many people claim this video came from the Middle East or India, but it indeed did come from Venezuela. This clip highlights the issue of forced labor and people trafficking in Venezuela, as many who work in the illegal mines tend to be migrants. The victim in this video has still yet to be identified and more than likely never will. What is known is that the victim was from Guyana and arrived in Venezuela to work the illegal mines. Why he was murdered is up to debate, but according to some reports, the victim was stealing or being in cahoots with people he shouldn't have been with, and this could possibly be why he was murdered. In one article, it says the victim's murder was ordered by a farmer named Tilson. Allegedly, he ordered the murder to send a message to his workers who stole from him. This seems to be the reason for the killing, as in the video you hear a man talking, accusing the victim of being a thief. The video is 2 minutes and 16 seconds long and is extremely hard to watch. Whatever you do, never go searching for it. In the first 15 seconds of the video, the person filming, who may be the farmer previously mentioned, roughly states, "This is a message to all of those who want to rob from my farm. I am the greatest in Venezuela." All while the statement is being read, the camera is fixated on the victim's face. The victim is lying on the ground on his back and is gagged with his hands tied. The victim looks young and, if I had to guess, is either in his late teens or early 20s. As he lays there waiting for his fate, the fear in his eyes says 1,000 words. After this statement is read, the brutality begins. A man then enters shot who has his face covered and is carrying some sort of knife. He bends down next to the victim and begins slicing off his right ear. The victim makes no noise, but he scrunches up his face and closes his eyes as he absorbs the pain. The gang member then moves over to the victim's left ear and slices it off. Once both ears are cut off, the victim lets out painful sighs. The killer then appears to hand the knife over to the person filming, and in a POV type of shot, you see the person filming waving the knife around while accusing him of being a thief, while saying, "This is what would happen to anyone who steals from me." The victim tries to plead his case and his voice cracks and breaks several times. You literally hear the fear in his voice. A man then enters shot who is the same man who cut off the victim's ears, but this time he is carrying a machete. The killer then takes the machete and slams the blade down against the victim's throat, hitting his Adam's apple area. Blood erupts from his neck, shooting up in the air, and you begin to hear the sound of gurgling blood. The victim instinctively sits up and blood pours out like a river. In a matter of seconds, his entire chest is covered red in blood. It looks like you kind of poured a bucket of red paint all over him. The noises you hear at this point are like squeals, and it's honestly horrific. The killer then takes the machete and slams the blade twice onto the back of the victim's neck, and the noises become even more horrific. The killer with the machete then takes the blade and strikes the victim several more times on the back of his neck, and at this point the victim appears to pass out or pass away. The amount of blood in this video is insane, and the quality of the video is actually good, making it even worse to watch. Because as we know, in most of these videos, the quality is pretty bad. The video then concludes as the victim is lying in a pool of his own blood, half decapitated. The fear in the victim's eyes really stick with you, and it's just sad. And what makes the video even worse is the fact that the victim is extremely young, maybe between the ages of 15 and 21. This is just another example of the disturbing world we live in, and this is just awful.
Wheelie bin murderer. In Surrey in 2019, one Friday morning, it was bin day. The bin men came along and tried to remove one of the bins from outside one of the houses. However, they noticed how heavy it was and they just simply couldn't remove it. When the landlord comes by 3 weeks later, he actually notices a human foot sticking out of the bin. Melanie Wallner, a 30-year-old South African woman, had been living at the house. She'd met a German man called Peter, and the two started dating and actually got married fairly quickly. However, the marriage was far from perfect, and it was claimed that Peter had many affairs. In 2006, Melanie found out about Peter's latest affair and confronted him about it. After an apparent argument, Melanie popped her sleep mask on and tried to get some rest. Peter then, while Melanie is completely unaware and defenseless, actually hits her around the head with a heavy griddle pan. He then put a plastic bag over her head and hid her body in a sleeping bag. He immediately went online and ordered a large lockable freezer. This is where he would eventually keep Melanie's body. He told neighbours that they had simply split up and she'd left the country. To her friends and family, however, he told them that there had been a terrible accident. He tried to do CPR, but unfortunately she passed away. When Melanie's parents tried to come to the UK, presumably to go to a funeral to say goodbye to their daughter, Peter insisted they didn't come. He even travelled to South Africa to see her parents and took an urn with him and said that he'd had her cremated. It turned out the urn was just filled with ash from his barbecue. Peter actually got away with this for 3 years until he wanted to move out of the property. He decided to place Melanie in a wheelie bin and hoped that the bin men would just take her and put her in landfill. Luckily, because the bin men refused to take the bin, Melanie was discovered. Peter tried to claim to police that he'd done this in self-defense. Obviously, the fact that she was wearing a sleep mask showed she was completely defenseless, and this was not a self-defense attack. Peter was given life in prison.
And he did say that he enjoys the Catch Me Outside girl and thinks she's funny. So let's just.
So that just shows what.
Let's be real. You want to put your dick in her?
I mean, it's rather
probably not.
enjoying someone and putting your.
What you just heard was Mr. Beast making a sex joke about a minor. And this is incredibly disturbing because Mr. Beast is one of the world's top children's entertainers. I mean, this is literally a photograph of him at the Kids' Choice Awards. And in that clip, you can hear him say, "Oh yeah, I would never do that. I was just kidding." But either way, that joke is so incredibly off color. I mean, the girl was, I think, 13 at the time that joke was made. And the phrase that came out of his mouth should just never come out of somebody's mouth, especially when you are running a huge YouTube channel. Now, I know that Mr. Beast can't go back in time and take back the things that he said, but in addition, there have been some other disturbing things that have come out recently, like all the drama against Ava Chris Tyson, Mr. Beast's very close friend and former employee, who was recently exposed for messaging minors sexual things on Discord, and also accused of a bunch of other things, including sexual assault. And a lot of people think that Mr. Beast Jimmy himself was covering all this stuff up, trying to protect his brand and his friend. Oh yeah, and let's not forget that Mr. Beast himself was in those same explicit Discord chats talking about, I don't even know how to say that without getting banned. There's also the fact that Mr. Beast hired and worked with a sex offender. These charges, you can access the court documents online, stem from this guy allegedly assaulting an 11-year-old girl. I say allegedly because Jake the Viking, this guy's brother-in-law, has been defending him all day. But I don't understand how a innocent man takes a plea deal on charges like that. And either way, he was a registered sex offender when Mr. Beast hired him. And I think it's incredibly ignorant and insulting to insinuate that you didn't check on this guy's background. I mean, I'm assuming that a very light background check would have revealed that this guy was a sexual predator. And yet, Mr. Beast did nothing. And yeah, this is it's really disturbing stuff. And if you think that in that podcast, that was the last time that the group talked about some pedophile stuff, you would be wrong.
No, seriously.
I mean, as long as there's no penetration, I mean, what's age anyways, right? I'm just...
This is by far one of the scariest unsolved murders. Let's talk about it. This is Russell and Shirley Dermond. They were married for 64 years and went on to have 4 kids together. They were living in a nice house in a gated community on Lake Oconee in Putnam County, Georgia, and they were really enjoying their peaceful retired life. They were extremely loved by the community, but on May 6, 2014, their lives would tragically end. Russell and Shirley were last seen alive on May 1st running some errands in Eatonton, and they last spoke to their son later that same day on the phone. A few days later, on May 3rd, the couple was supposed to attend a party with their neighbors for the 2014 Kentucky Derby, but they never showed up. 3 more days would pass with no word from the Dermonds, and their neighbors became so worried that they went to their house to check on them. When they arrived, they found that the front door was unlocked, so they let themselves in. Everything inside the house seemed perfectly fine, but when the neighbor entered the garage, they found Russell's decapitated body lying in a pool of blood surrounded by towels. They obviously called 911 immediately because of the horrific scene, and when police arrived, they quickly realized that Shirley was missing. Police initially thought that Shirley had been kidnapped, so a massive search was launched. But sadly, 10 days later, Shirley's decomposed body was found floating in Lake Oconee by a couple of fishermen. She had initially been weighed down by 2 30-pound concrete blocks. According to the autopsy, Shirley died from 2 or 3 deep wounds to the head from a blunt object. Authorities initially believed that the murder stemmed from a robbery, but there were no signs of a break-in and nothing was taken from their home. Hundreds of tips and leads started pouring in, but to this day, the case remains unsolved. And the most horrifying part is that Russell's head has never been found. According to reports, gunshot residue was found on his collar, leading authorities to believe that he was decapitated after being shot in the head in order to stop police from finding the bullet. Over the years, people have speculated that the Dermonds' deaths were related to their oldest son, Mark. Mark was killed in Atlanta in 2000 during a drug dispute, but police strongly believe that there is no connection. What makes this case so confusing is that there's still so many unanswered questions. Police still don't know whether or not the killer entered through the front gate of the community or if they had access to the back of the house by boat, but they do believe that multiple people were involved. Police also believe that the towels surrounding Russell's decapitated body were placed there to stop his blood from seeping out underneath the garage door. And as far as the concrete blocks tied to Shirley's body, investigators said that a professional would know that that wouldn't work. So the question remains on who would do this and why. According to police, new DNA evidence and cell phone data was discovered last year that they are hoping will lead to the people responsible, but they don't know if it's enough DNA evidence to be run through CODIS or if it even belongs to the killer. At this point, it could still just belong to Russell and Shirley. Investigators are using new technology to analyze the recent cell phone data found that wasn't existent in 2014, so they remain hopeful. But it's now been 10 years, and whoever killed Russell and Shirley and took his head is still out there.
If you've seen this man in your dreams, I have some bad news. So this is Hatman, and he is one of the most commonly seen sleep paralysis demons in the entire world. And here's how you know if you're about to see him. First, you'll wake up in the middle of the night and you won't be able to move at all. Like you'll feel completely paralyzed. Next, you'll feel a crushing feeling on your chest like something is sitting on it. And when this happens, it's going to be very hard to breathe. And at that point, there's nothing you can do. That's when Hatman comes into your room. Many doctors believe that Hatman is just a fragment of people's imaginations, but a lot of people think that he's shown up in photos like this one, or this eerie one that was taken on the day of these women's mother's funeral. In the next part, I'm gonna read some stories of people who believe they've seen him. If you see him while you're awake, run. So this story actually comes from a Reddit user who's a therapist, and this user had a patient who was coming in complaining of seeing Hatman at night. This patient would apparently wake up in the middle of the night to see Hatman standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep. And as a result, they were not really sleeping much. So the therapist prescribed some pretty heavy sleeping medication, and as a result, the patient starts getting a little better. But then one day, the patient comes in and just looks like they had seen a ghost. So the therapist asked them what was wrong, and they said that as they were getting in the car to come to therapy, they saw Hatman standing across the street during the day. This therapist had only ever heard of Hatman when it came to patients waking up in the middle of the night and seeing him, never when they were already awake doing things in the middle of the day. So the patient is terrified, but the therapist thinks this might be a side effect of the medication. It takes a little while to get used to. But that was the last time the patient ever came to see the therapist.
Do you know about the Harry Potter actor that got sent to prison? You may remember Jamie Waylett, who played the Hogwarts bully Vincent Crabbe in the Harry Potter films. Although for many actors this would be a dream come true to be in such well-known films, Jamie reportedly struggled with the fame. He began to use substances in order to cope with his mental health struggles. In 2012, London saw some of the most devastating riots, including looting and arson, as well as the deaths of 5 people. Jamie was arrested for being involved in the riots. He was pictured getting involved in looting and holding a bottle full of petrol. He was also with a gang of at least 4 people who went into Chalk Farm on the 8th of August. He also had a previous conviction for substance possession at that time. In 2012, he received a 2-year sentence for violent disorder and 12 months for handling stolen goods. It's believed that since being released from prison, he hasn't been in any big films.
So you may have seen the TikTok that I made exposing this pedophile Gary Glitter for his crimes that he committed. But I have some really unfortunate news. After just serving half of his sentence, he was just released from prison in the UK. That means that this man, who was found with thousands of images of CP and was convicted of assaulting 2 young girls in a foreign country, is now free. Gary Glitter is a notorious musician. If you don't know, he wrote the song Rock and Roll, which is played at football games and other sporting events, and was featured in the movie The Joker in 2019. But his life has been mired with controversy. This guy has assaulted multiple kids, and he was found, like I said before, with CP materials on his computer. But thankfully, people in the UK are putting up a fuss about him being released from prison. There were actually some riots and protests outside of the hostel that he was released to. But even the family that lives next door to the hostel has gone to the news and said they're concerned because they're now living next to Gary Glitter, and they know what he did. So what do you think? Did he serve his time? Is he a reformed man, or should he still be incarcerated? Let me know below.
This man killed his brother for not thanking him for cooking dinner. It was the 7th of March 2003 in Wainuiomata, New Zealand. A family meal was underway. 36-year-old Fergus Glenn had made dinner at his parents' house. One of the people he had cooked for was his 33-year-old brother, Craig. Craig was a family man with a wife and 3 children. It's believed that the pair had an ongoing feud, and on the day in question, Craig not thanking Fergus for cooking appeared to be the final straw. That evening, Craig went to sleep unaware of the horrors that would unfold. Shortly after, his mum woke to the sound of blows coming from the room that Craig was sleeping in. She initially thought this sounded like a wood chipper. She got up to investigate and found Fergus on the stairs. He calmly told his mum, "I've done him with an axe." Fergus had chillingly struck his brother 8 times with the weapon. It is likely that Craig knew very little about the attack. Experts claimed that it would be likely that the first strike would have killed him straight away or at least knocked him unconscious. Later in 2003, Fergus pleaded guilty in court. He was sentenced to a lifetime term with a minimum of 10 years. A woman from Northern Ireland vanished under mysterious circumstances. Now her family have shared this eerie photo to bring attention to her unsolved case. Lisa Dorian was 25 years old when she vanished on the 27th of February 2005. Lisa was from Bangor and she was last seen in Ballyhalbert Caravan Park. During that time, she was with someone called Mark Lovett, who was 17 at the time. It's believed that they were both drunk at this point and had been taking substances, causing them to experience hallucinations. When Mark was questioned by police after the woman disappeared, he stated that around 4:45 a.m. they were startled by noises and flashing lights. Both terrified, he said they ran off in different directions and he never saw her again. Police believe that Lisa was murdered and they have endlessly tried to find her remains. Tragically for this family, they have had no luck and no closure in this case. Her family have released this eerie photograph of the last place she was before she went missing to try and provoke the conscience of whoever may have killed her. There have been more than 400 confidential tips throughout the years, but nothing leading to the discovery of Lisa's body or remains. A £20,000 reward has been offered by Crime Stoppers for anyone who could provide any information leading to either the arrest or conviction of those responsible.
A real-life devil in disguise. Abigail White was an OnlyFans model, also known as Fake Barbie. Last year, she murdered her boyfriend. Bradley Lewis, 22, was also the father of Abigail's 3 children. The couple had been having arguments, and she said at one point she managed to beat the truth out of him after suspecting him of cheating. The couple had been getting into arguments, and Bradley had been living with his mother. They were at the park on March 25th, 2022 with their children when Bradley told Abigail he no longer wanted to be with her. That night they got into an argument at home, and Abigail grabbed a knife from the kitchen and plunged it straight into Bradley's heart. Abigail then began screaming hysterically, which alerted one of the neighbours, who came round and found Bradley laying on the floor. She dialed 999 and started CPR. Bradley was rushed to hospital but sadly died the next day from a single stab wound to his chest. A post-mortem showed a 7-centimetre deep wound straight into his heart. Abigail was arrested and she told police that they got into an argument and Bradley had grabbed the knife from the kitchen. She said that she took it off him, went to the front of the house and she was going to throw it outside when Bradley came towards her, grabbed her hands and made it seem as if she'd plunged the knife into his chest. She told them that the wound was 100% self-inflicted by Bradley. Abigail pleaded not guilty, but police found voice notes on her phone, some of which were saying that she was capable of killing him and saying that the only way to get the truth out of him was to threaten his life. Abigail was found guilty and sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years. Shockingly, she's actually managed to find a new boyfriend from behind bars and is asking prison officers to give her conjugal visits with her new man.
These are pictures with the most disturbing backstories, part 5. This is Travis the chimp. And he lived with Sandra and Jerome Harold since he was a young chimp and was often treated like a member of the family. However, one day he exhibited unusually aggressive behavior, which made the Harolds call their friend Nash for assistance. But when Nash arrived at the Harolds' home, Travis the chimp suddenly attacked her. And the attack was extremely gruesome. Travis the chimp targeted Nash's face and hands. It ripped off both of her eyelids and then proceeded to rip her nose clean off, blinding her and also severing several parts of her body and lacerating her face. Travis the chimp was then shot and killed by police who arrived at the scene. Nash's injuries were so severe that she underwent a face transplant and lost both of her hands in an attempt to save her life. But miraculously, she would pull through. I would show you pictures of the attack, but they're extremely gruesome and I probably can't show them. So instead, I will play the 911 call made by the Harolds as Nash was being attacked by Travis the chimp. And you can hear the chimp in the video going absolutely crazy.
What's the problem?
Police! Send the police!
What's the problem there?
The chimp killed my friend!
What's the problem with your friend? I need to know.
Send the police up! With a gun! With a gun! Hurry
Who
up!
has a gun?
Please, hurry up! He's killing my girlfriend!
What is the problem?
He's killing my friend!
Who's killing your friend?
My chimpanzee!
Oh, your chimpanzee is killing your friend.
He ripped her apart! Hurry up!
With a gun.
Hurry up, please!
There's someone on the way.
With guns, please! Shoot him!
What is the monkey doing? Tell me what the monkey's doing.
He ripped her face off!
He ripped her face off?
He's trying to attack me! Please, please!
Okay,
hurry.
I need you to calm down a little bit. They're on the way. Can you put yourself away? I don't want...
Okay, remember that girl that asked to get off the plane because she said the person next to her wasn't human? Well, the video I'm about to show you, she says exactly what she saw. And it's absolutely terrifying.
Probably not gonna make it.
Okay. So, what happened on the flight?
Finally, someone drops the question right.
So we weren't there. So what happened on the flight?
Well, the asshole beside me, I switched seats with.
Okay. Was it the gentleman that was sitting right there with you? Inside?
I switched seats with him, thinking like it was gonna be a good idea.
Yeah.
Then he stole my AirPods, and then he like had his face up, and I tried to talk to him, and he wouldn't. He had what?
So were you in that other male, the one that got escorted out?
Oh no, the other male never got escorted out. Just I did because I said I wasn't comfortable being on that flight with him.
You know, she did just push him basically on his choice. But he's not really wanting to pursue anything. He's
Getting all this. Do you have it all on screen record, please?
several times whether or not he wanted to continue or do something.
Shelby, do you have it all on screen
More
record?
than just take a picture with it.
For him?
Okay.
So what's your plan now?
Nothing. Wait till you see what happens.
What do you mean?
What do you mean?
See what happens with what? What's your plan from here?
I'm going home. I'm not getting
So you have somebody come to pick you up, or Uber, Lyft? Well, yes, because obviously we just got reports that you assaulted somebody by pushing the gentleman inside, okay?
Wait, I assaulted someone?
That's what multiple people
Okay, so
reported, okay?
I'm
So hold on,
5'2".
hold
Wait,
on,
hold on. I'm
Okay.
5'2", 120 pounds.
Okay, can you let me
5'2",
finish?
120 pounds.
Can you let me finish?
Yeah.
So the gentleman is not wanting to press charges, okay? Okay? So regardless, he's not wanting to press
Wait,
charges.
hey, could I hurt
Okay.
you? How tall are you?
So with that being said,
How tall are you? Could I hurt you?
so with that being said,
Exactly.
how do you plan on getting home? Because you can't hang out here. If you have no business at the airport, you can't be here.
I don't want to be here.
Okay, so who's coming to pick you up?
An Uber.
Okay, have we already requested it?
I will gladly, Chris.
Set alight and burned alive by his own mother, Andre was just 8 years old when he was murdered, with his 12-year-old sister witnessing the whole thing. It was March 2021 in Russia, and Andre's mother Anastasia was having an affair. Andre had witnessed the visit from this man, and when his stepdad returned home, he told him everything. There was a text message on Anastasia's phone sent to another man that said, "I'm married to one man, but in love with another," and this was just the proof that her husband needed to believe Andre. Anastasia flew into a rage, and after holding Andre's hand over an open flame on their stove, she took him outside and doused him in petrol. According to Andre's 12-year-old sister Natasha, the petrol was poured over Andre's head and it was filling up his mouth. He was asking his mum to stop as she lit the matches. She lit 3, which failed to take light, but the 4th one did, and she threw it towards his jumper and set him alight. He ran into the garden, engulfed in flames, and fell to his hands and knees. This is when Anastasia says she ran over and tried to put the flames out with snow. However, her 12-year-old daughter has a different story. Natasha said that after lighting the match, her mother said to her, "Let's watch how the scarecrow burns," and she had to stand there and watch as her 8-year-old brother was burned alive. Her stepdad then came running out of the house and put the fire out. Andre was rushed to hospital with horrific burns all over his head and body. He died the next day while being transferred to a specialist burns unit. Anastasia was arrested and was asked to reenact exactly what she did to her son.
Открыла канистру и вот так налила.
Он что в тот момент делал?
Подождите. Стоял.
Просто никаких не убежать не пытался?
Нет.
Лили куда?
Вот так вот.
На голову?
Да, вот сбоку получается.
Сколько примерно?
Примерно не больше 200 грамм. Взяла спички.
Ну, поджигайте спички. Демонстрируйте, как оно было.
То есть, вот сейчас спичка загорелась, а у меня 3 спички не загорелась, загорелась только 4-я. И держа вот так вот спичку, 4-я просто загорелась кофта у ребенка. Я бросила спичку, у меня ребенок начал убегать в огород.
Anastasia denied the murder of Andrei, saying that she only wanted to scare him.
В умышленном убийстве нет, конечно же. Напугать, но не убивать ребенка. Я не желала своему ребенку смерти. Так, значит, было суждено и ему, и мне.
She was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her daughter Natasha is now in the foster care system.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This politician took his own life on live TV. This is Robert Bud Dyer, and he was an American politician who ended his own life in a live press conference. In the early 1980s, Pennsylvania discovered that its state workers had overpaid federal taxes due to errors in state withholding prior to Dyer's administration. A multi-million-dollar recovery contract was required to determine the compensation to be given to each employee. In 1986, Dyer was convicted of accepting a bribe from Computer Technology Associates, a California-based firm, to award them the contract. He was found guilty on 11 counts of conspiracy, mail fraud, perjury, and interstate transportation in aid of racketeering. And Robert Bud Dyer was scheduled to be sentenced on January 23, 1987, but on January 22nd, Robert Dyer called a news conference in the Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg, during which he fatally shot himself, ending his own life with a .357 Magnum revolver in front of reporters. This was then broadcasted later that day to a wide television audience across Pennsylvania. And I'm going to explain the whole thing right now. After Dyer finished speaking at the news conference, he pulled out an envelope with a model .357 Magnum revolver in it. And when the crowd in the room saw what Dyer pulled out of the envelope, the mood changed immediately. The question on everyone's mind was no longer whether or not Dyer would resign, but what he planned on doing with the firearm. Inside the room, people gasped and Dyer backed up against the wall, holding the weapon close to his body. Dyer then calmly said, "Please, please leave the room if this will affect you." Among those people who stayed, some pleaded with Dyer to surrender the gun while others tried to approach him and seize the weapon. However, Dyer warned against either action, exclaiming his last words, don't, this will hurt someone." Robert Dyer then quickly put the muzzle of the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, firing a shot through the roof of his mouth and into his brain. He collapsed on the floor dead. Blood ran out through the back of his head and through his nose. 9 news cameras recorded the events, and one of the cameras remained focused on Dyer and captured close-up footage of the aftermath of the shooting, as his body was slumped and blood strewn from the exit wound in the back of his head, as well as from his nostrils and mouth. He died instantly from the gunshot shortly before 11 a.m., but was not pronounced dead until 11:31 a.m. This is definitely one of the craziest things to ever happen on live TV, and what's even crazier is that the footage is still out there. I don't recommend searching or looking for this video because it does depict extremely disturbing things that might be unsettling to people. Can you just imagine watching this in 1987 expecting a normal news conference, and then something like this happens?
Beautiful Finley Bowden was taken into care at just 3 days old. 10 months later, he was given back to his parents, and after 39 days in their care, in the early hours of his first Christmas morning, he was murdered. Quick trigger warning, there is a description of Finley's injuries in the video, and they are horrific. Stephen Bowden, 30, and Shannon Marsden, 22, were drug users and lived in a squalid home that you wouldn't even house an animal in. There was filthy bedding, filthy clothing, an unusable bathroom, and rotting food in the kitchen. There were also signs of drug use scattered around the house. Stephen and Shannon were 24 and 17 when their relationship began, and when Shannon fell pregnant, Child protection concerns meant that her baby would be taken into care shortly after being born, as they were not fit to be parents. Finley was born in February 2020 and taken into care at 3 days old. However, in October 2020, he was given back to his parents over an 8-week period, despite social workers asking for a longer transition. Family courts decided that Finley should be given back to his parents under an 8-week plan, including unsupervised visits and overnight stays of varying durations. On November 17th, Finley was placed back into his parents' care permanently. Over the next 10 days in November, there were 3 visits by social workers, and on December 23rd, a social worker visited the house but was refused entry. 2 days later, Finley was murdered. The couple waited a whole hour after Finley's death to call for an ambulance, as Stephen needed to hide his drugs. Finley's autopsy showed a catalogue of horrific injuries. He had 57 fractures to his bones, including 45 rib fractures, a broken shoulder, a broken arm, a broken shin bone. His thigh was broken in 4 places, and his pelvis was broken in 2 places after being stamped on. He also had several burn marks from a hot, flat surface and a cigarette lighter, and 130 bruises all over his tiny body. He'd also developed pneumonia, endocarditis, inflammation of the lining of the heart, and sepsis. This wasn't a quick accidental death. It was a long, drawn-out, painful process for Finley, inflicted by the 2 people that he should have relied on for protection. A search of the couple's internet history showed some really disturbing things. Just before Finley had been returned to them, they'd read a story about a father that had been charged for killing his 2-month-old son. Another was a woman that had been charged for killing her 20-month-old daughter through neglect. There were lots more similar searches leading right up to Finley's death. Stephen and Shannon both denied murder, but due to the overwhelming evidence, a jury found them both guilty in April 2023, and they'll be sentenced at a later date. They showed absolutely zero emotion as they were found guilty.
This is Gary Glitter, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. And this guy was a rock star. The story is extremely disturbing. So all of the bad things that Gary Glitter had done in the past resurfaced in 2019 when The Joker came out. His song was the one that was used during this infamous dancing stairway scene. But let's rewind. Paul Francis Gadd was born in 1944 in England. It was in the year 1971 during the glam rock movement when Paul began to use the stage name Gary Glitter and his career really took off. The release of his album titled Glitter was a massive success. The song Rock and Roll reached high points on all charts across the world, and he seemed to be this, new age progressive rock and roll star. And for years, Gary was heralded as a rock and roll icon. This guy was loved by thousands, millions of people across the planet. But that would all change in the year 1997 when Gary took his computer into a repair shop in England. The technician at the time that was taking a look at Gary's laptop discovered CP images on his hard drive. The police then got involved. They searched his home and found even more CP. This guy was sick. After all was said and done, it was discovered that Gary had downloaded over 4,000 images of CP onto his computer. He had also had a relationship with a 14-year-old girl in the 1970s, and he was given a 4-month prison sentence. After he was released from prison, Gary felt the heat from the public now hating him in England, so he fled to another country. But after the authorities in Cambodia discovered who he was exposed, and he was then deported to Bangkok. He eventually settled, though, in Vietnam. And it was in Vietnam where Gary resumed his typical pedo behaviors. He was banned from a nightclub for groping a teenage waitress. Other people saw him bringing 2 young girls into his home. And on November 12, 2005, Gary fled his home in Vietnam. Authorities eventually searched the place and found a 15-year-old girl that was living with him. He then tried to escape the country, but he was arrested at the airport. And from that point on, multiple Vietnamese girls came forward that were underage and said that Gary Glitter had, assaulted them in the past. After all was said and done, he was sentenced to about 3 years in prison in Vietnam. And if he would have been convicted on all the charges that he faced, he might have been executed by firing squad. Eventually, though, he served his sentence and he was released in Vietnam. And after a lot of countries said they wouldn't let Gary Glitter in, he returned home to the UK. But he wasn't safe there. He was arrested shortly after arriving back in the UK after he faced a number of new allegations against him. Eventually, he was charged with 8 counts of sexual offenses against girls from the ages of 12 to 14 in the years 1977 to 1980. One of these charges alleged that he even crept into a 10-year-old girl's bed and attempted to essay her. So after a lengthy trial, he was finally caught again. He was imprisoned, but he could be released next year in 2023. I know that the movie The Joker received a lot of backlash for using Gary Glitter's song because he was compensated with royalties, even after all of these things had happened to him. And yeah, this just shows that this guy was not and is not a good dude.
This killer accidentally admitted to his crimes by accident when he forgot he was wearing a microphone while taking part in a documentary. This is how a true crime documentary exposed a killer. In 1971, Robert Durst met Kathleen McCormack and they got married. At the time of her disappearance in 1982, Kathleen had nearly graduated college. She was last seen by a witness at a dinner party where she appeared to be upset. She got a call from Robert and left. Robert admitted to having argued with Kathleen that night, but he said he put her on a train to New York and then never saw her again. Her friend called police to report her missing. Interestingly, Kathleen had been treated at a medical centre for facial bruises weeks prior to this and told the friend that Robert had done it. Robert had actually been dating someone else for some time prior to this and had been living separately to Kathleen. When her family broke into her cottage to try and find out where she was, they found the place had been trashed and her possessions put in the bin. Kathleen's family always believed that Robert was involved in her disappearance. In 2000, Susan Berman, a friend of Robert's, was found murdered. Now, she'd actually provided Robert with an alibi for Kathleen's disappearance. Now, pay really close attention to this next bit. Days after she was killed, a letter addressed to the Beverly Hills Police Department contained Susan's address and the word cadaver on it. On the envelope, Beverly was misspelled. Robert admitted in 2005 that Susan had called him shortly before her death to say that the police wanted to question her about Kathleen going missing. It's believed that Robert killed Susan to keep her quiet. In 2001, Robert's neighbour's body parts were found floating in Galveston Bay. Robert's elderly neighbour, Morris Black, had been killed and Robert was arrested. He was actually released on bail and fled and was found about a month later in Pennsylvania. He was found with $37,000 cash, 2 weapons, and interestingly, Morris Black's driving license. In court, Robert claimed he was acting in self-defense. He said he'd accidentally shot Morris and dismembered his body. Due to lack of forensics, he only got 5 years in jail. This is where things get really crazy. HBO was filming a documentary called The Jinx. During production, Susan's stepson found a letter written by Robert. This contained the same spelling error in the word Beverly as the anonymous letter to police. This implicated Robert in the murder. Now, while filming the documentary, Robert needed the toilet. He forgot that he had a microphone still attached to him. He was recorded talking to himself. He said, "There it is, you're caught. You're right, of course, but you can't imagine. Arrest him." And then he said, "What a disaster. He was right. I was wrong." And finally he said, "I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." Family of this missing girl found out via the media that she'd been murdered, butchered, and sold as kebab meat. This case will put you off ever eating a kebab again. Charlene Downs disappeared aged just 14 years old in November 2003. She was living in Blackpool, UK, and was last seen in an area containing many kebab shops and takeaways. While out with her friends one night, Charlene bumped into her mum. Her mum said that Charlene needed to be home by 10 p.m. that night, which was quite typical for Charlene. Tragically, this would be the last time that her mum would ever see Charlene alive. When Charlene didn't turn up by 10 p.m, her dad went out on his bike looking for her for around half an hour. When he couldn't find her, he just presumed that she'd stayed over at her friend's house and went home and went to sleep. When she still didn't arrive the next morning, her parents started to get worried and they called police. Police, however, said that they could not report this as a missing person until she'd been missing for 48 hours. Eventually, police did start to look for her, but they said that they presumed she was a runaway. The case went cold until 3 years later. Charlene's family were called into a police station. There was news of 2 men who had been arrested, linked with a local takeaway called Funny Boys. They were arrested on suspicion of murder and disposal of Charlene. This is when the family found out some shocking news via the media about what had happened to Charlene. An article published stated that she had been grinded up and sold as kebab meat. One of the brothers of the men who had been arrested had heard them bragging about doing this. Now, Charlene's disappearance actually unearthed the fact that these takeaways were being used as a front for P rings, where men were luring teenagers in with food and alcohol in exchange for things I cannot repeat on this app. When the case against these two men went to trial, the jury failed to reach a verdict. The case was then thrown out of court due to apparent lack of physical evidence. One of the reasons for this is how well Charlene's body had obviously been disposed of. Both men who had been charged were given £250,000 compensation for being falsely trialed. Around a week after the trial, Charlene's mum was actually arrested for stabbing her husband. He declined to press charges, saying that he knew she had been stressed. Members of the family were also charged with racially aggravated assault against the brother of the man who'd been charged with murder, and also punching the man who'd been charged with helping dispose of her body. In August 2017, police arrested a 51-year-old man who lived in Blackpool at the time of Charlene's disappearance. This was on suspicion of murdering her, however, he was released just 2 days later. We still have no justice for Charlene, and nobody is behind bars for her killing.